and welcome back to the Lighthouse. We're about to beam up to the innovation constellation where our speaker, Mariana Mazzucato, is waiting. Mariana, welcome back to YSI. It's great to see you with us. Now, remember why we're here. We're here to, over the course of the YSI plenary, to converge on the 100 most pertinent questions of our time that we would like to focus on in our future research. And here to help us is, of course, amongst many speakers today, Mariana Mazzucato. The innovation constellation uses the word innovation that is perhaps used as a buzzword in many spheres. But we're not here to have a simple and narrow conversation about innovation. We're here to have a bigger conversation. We want to be here to change the conversation. And who better than Mariana to help broaden that conversation about global transformations and public purpose as we think about the challenges of our time. Now, as we go into this constellation and suggest our questions that Mariana will discuss with us throughout the session that's upcoming, we would like to now again remind us how this mission function actually works. So let's go take a look.
First, go to ysiplenary.org and click the night sky. This is the question sphere, where each star is a question, and each group of stars, or constellation, contains questions within a particular topic. You can find question sphere sessions in the schedule in the left sidebar and join them from there. Just enter the session and join the Zoom. As you listen to the speaker motivate their questions, think about which questions you believe to be pertinent for YSI. While the speaker talks, suggest your questions to your peers by entering them into the panel. This is not a Q&A. The questions are suggestions for research in YSI, not a question for the speaker to answer. Take a look at all the questions that were suggested and like the ones that you think are best. The questions moderator will select the most liked questions and present them to the speaker for a comment. These questions will be added to the constellation, where they can be further refined. Refine the questions by finding the best exact phrasing. Suggest a rephrasing yourself, or like the rephrasings that you think are good. After the session is over, you can find the submitted questions in the constellations. As a plenary participant, you can mark your 10 favorite questions in the graph. Just click the star in the corner of the questions card, and they will be added to your YSI profile. The most popular questions will make it into the final list.
So before we go up into the constellation, let's have a final check. Question moderator, Alexander, check. Session moderator, Fernanda, check. Mariana, check. All right, we're all ready to go. Let's go into the constellation. See you there.
It's a new innovation. If you invented it, then we'll give you an ovation. Does it further intertwine us while it simplifies payments, as it instantly connects us with the right information? Yeah, but also shares your data sets and tracks your location, so that your next prospective vendor knows you're going and staying. Oh, and it's addictive. There are 17 seasons. You can buy it over the counter, though you don't need a reason. Innovation, it's on. But when's an innovation right and when is it wrong? History decides it as we sidle along, until it blows up like a hoverboard or hydrogen bomb. Who can tell if an invention's made to benefit creation, or if it's in its essence just destructive, inhumane, and not a go? And if it's both, then what's the balance of the gain and of the loss? Feeling lost, aren't we all? Innovation.
Sasha, you're on. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the question fair session with the speech of Mariana Mazzucato. As you have heard in the introduction, we will, during the first part of the session, during the speech, be trying to formulate questions that will be brought up to the speaker. We will do that by submitting them within the graph, and those of them that have most likes, as we will also be liking them, will then be brought up to our speaker to talk about, and as those of them that have the most likes will then be specifically discussed by us here. And without further ado, I hand it over to the session moderator, Pertinent. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Fernanda Steiner Perin, a coordinator of Hello?
Yep, we hear you.
Yeah?
Mm-hmm.
Hello, everyone. I'm Fernanda Steiner Perin, a coordinator of Economics of Innovation Working Group. I want to welcome Professor Mariana Mazzucato. We are excited to have you here today. Mariana Mazzucato is professor in Economics of Innovation and Public Value at University College London, where she is founding director of the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. She is author of The Entrepreneur State, Debunking Public versus Private Sector Myths, and The Value of Everything, Making and Taking in the Global Economy. So now, Mariana, you can give us a speech.
Thank you. If you put up the slides. Great. So it's wonderful to be here. I love YSI, and it's too bad we can't all be in the same room. I've always found it one of the most dynamic parts of the Institute of New Economic Thinking, and I've really enjoyed taking part in the past of the YSI events. In fact, last year we actually hosted one around rethinking the state, actually. And this will be very much at the center of what I'll be talking about today. So for some reason, my clicker has disappeared. Let me turn it back on. Here we go. You guys are much more technological than I am. Great. So what I wanted to focus my 30 minutes on is really how can we take seriously this issue that growth has not just a rate, but a direction, the kind of directionality problem. And because I do believe that economic theory of the state and of policy making, the kind of notion that the state is just there to at best fix market failures, doesn't actually prep us properly to tackle some of the biggest problems we have today, whether it's the climate crisis, the health pandemic, getting investment-led growth instead of consumption-led private debt-fueled growth. And the good news, though, is that this whole notion of directionality and kind of building back better is very much at the center of the international stage, especially after the financial crisis, right? Which there was no lack of growth that got us into the crisis. It was very much the kind of growth that we had. And since then, actually in 2015, we've had a global consensus about the Sustainable Development Goals, these 17 really ambitious goals that have 169 targets beneath them. There's lots of talk about smart, inclusive, sustainable growth. I just put here European Horizon 2020 because they've been talking about kind of challenge-led growth now for a long time. And of course, there's globally this discussion about, getting a Green New Deal. So in the US, very much led by AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, but also in Europe, the Green Deal agenda has really risen up away from just being within, say, DG environment to actually being at the center of the Commission's policy. So Ursula von der Leyen, the commissioner and the head of the Commission, has very much put the Green Deal at the center of rethinking European growth. And I should also say a great thing, which maybe our friends outside of Europe don't know, that the recovery scheme right now under COVID, the COVID recovery scheme in Europe, where the total is about 2 trillion euros, of which the pot specifically for COVID, in terms of the COVID recovery, is called EU Next Gen, and that's 800 billion euros. That's actually conditional on investments being made nationally at the member state level around climate and around digitalization. So for the first time, we actually have EU recovery schemes that are conditional not on austerity, but actually directing growth in a particular way. So all this is the good news, right? There's also a comeback of industrial strategy after being a blasphemy for decades in many countries. And so the kind of assumption behind my talk today is that, hey, if we want to have a direction for growth, let's think what that actually means, both for economic theory and for policy making in a practical way. But the good news is I don't have to say if we want, to grow in this way. There's all this talk and, big goals having been agreed on that say we do. So it doesn't have to be a hypothesis. The only hypothesis is how do we get there? Not so much do we want to actually, build back better, build in a way that is, more inclusive, more sustainable, and so on. And also inside the business community now for some time, there we go. There's been also a big debate actually about the need to change corporate governance away from simply maximizing, quarterly returns, maximizing shareholder value, towards a new sense of stakeholder value. This term that lots of us have been using for decades has kind of risen up in the corporate boardroom, at least in the talk. Don't worry, I'm not so naive. I know it hasn't changed, but still, there's, again, if we just look at the discussions out there, lots of talk about changing how corporate governance is actually done to be more purposeful, towards actually investing in workers and communities, and not just in areas, say, like share buybacks, which I'll get onto in a minute. And so what I really want to argue is that this notion of bringing purpose to business is not enough. We need to bring purpose to the center of our system, of our economic system, and do so at the same time that we talk about directionality, that we talk about the SDGs, that we talk about the need for a Green Deal. But if we don't find a way to concretely bring this notion of purpose to the center of how public and private interactions work, then it's, again, just going to remain kind of a Davos World Economic Forum kind of cocktail hour talk rather than a real change. And part of this is also because we need to bring purpose also to the center of how we think about government itself. So how we think about corporate governance, but also changing how we think about policy, not just in terms of fixing market failures, but actually actively reimagining what do we even want to do. And within that, think about not fixing markets, but co-creating and co-shaping markets to get there, right? So we really do need a wide and active, both theoretical and empirical, kind of practical discussion about changing how we do government, how we do business, but especially how we do public-private partnerships. I sometimes talk to biologists and they always say, if I put out there the word ecosystem, innovation ecosystem, they say, oh, hold on a second, what are you talking about? What kind of ecosystem? Is it parasitic, predator-prey, symbiotic, mutualistic? So this notion of bringing purpose to the center of how we understand our economy in order to direct it explicitly towards achieving big goals actually requires, I would argue, having proper metrics for how do we build a symbiotic and mutualistic public-private partnership. So this is really going to be the big theme of what I talk about in my remaining 24 minutes. And what I want to do is put out some ideas of how to do that. What does it look like to bring purpose to the center of public-private partnerships in a real way and not just in a cocktail hour Davos kind of way. And before I do that, I just want to make sure we're on the same page on some really big problems that we have out there, which is why we actually need to be talking about this in the first place. There's no point in redirecting growth if everything's fine and dandy. And I'm sure the INET YSI community knows this, but I just wanted to go quickly over some of the biggest problems we have out there. I'm sure some of your other speakers will have gone through them, hence I'll go through them quickly, but it's just important for the backdrop of this discussion. So I'm just going to mention 5 big problems. There's more than 5 problems, but focus on 5 problems for a minute. The first is what we've seen in the financial sector, and we know finance is very important to modern day capitalism, but if we have the wrong kind of finance, we have a big fat problem. And the reason I think we have the wrong kind of finance and financial dynamics is that finance has to a large extent been financing itself. So this graph here from the Bank of England, which was in a piece that Andy Haldane wrote some years ago, just showed, for example, for the UK economy, just how much the financial sector, widely understood in terms of financial intermediation, so it's not just banks, has been outpacing the growth of the rest of the economy. And to a large extent, this has been due to the way that finance has been going back into different parts of finance, so finance, insurance, and real estate, where the acronym is FIRE. This graph here is from, again, some Bank of England data showing that, for example, in the UK economy, less than 20% of bank lending even goes to the productive sector. Most of it, again, goes into other parts of the financial system, for example, into the real estate market that I already mentioned. And this has, to a large extent, both in the US and the UK, been fueling, in fact, the housing kind of bubble and the real estate bubble. And, it's quite striking how little this is talked about in the UK. The degree, the ratio of private debt to disposable income is actually back at record levels to what it was just before the financial crisis. And this is very much also due to how we are encouraging through policy, through active policy making, getting people to actually buy houses they can't even afford. Why can't they afford them? Because real wages haven't been going up. I could say more about this, but let me leave it to the side. So this is the first problem, which is the financialization of finance. The second problem is the financialization of industry. I'm sure you've had Bill Azonik lecturing to you either before or in the future here. He's written a lot about this. We also wrote some articles together, just how much increase there's been in the lack of reinvestment of profits back into the real economy. He and others have measured this in terms of share buybacks. So in this wonderful Harvard Business Review article he wrote, he showed that in the last decade, over $4 trillion has been used for share buybacks. And when you speak to companies, and I do this all the time, I say, why are you doing this? Why aren't you reinvesting profits back in? They might say things like, oh, there's no opportunities for investment. And if you look at the companies that are extracting an increasing amount of value from the economy, that's how I've talked about it in terms of value extraction and value destruction, but value extraction goes above value creation. Some of the sectors where you see this most are areas like energy and health. And of course, there are opportunities there. So what does one do about that? And why is this kind of lame excuse used? And you really see this also in the macro data. If you look at global investment as a share of GDP in many countries, especially those that are in fact ultra financialized, has been falling. And, this isn't, again, talked about enough. We hear discussions, for example, about will robots take our jobs, but we don't then relate that actually to corporate governance, right? So if you read David Ricardo back in the 1800s, he was already back then saying robots are taking our jobs, the famous chapter on machinery in Principles of Political Economy, where mechanization was in fact labor displacing. But since the time of David Ricardo up until about the early 80s, what actually happened is even though mechanization was labor displacing, as long as profits were reinvested back in, that actually created new jobs, new skills, et cetera. So it's really this lack of reinvestment, which is a huge global problem, and it's not as understood as, say, the simple, or not simple, but the issues around robots and the future of technology. And also they're not linked. Third problem, inequality. This is itself an outcome, actually, of those first two problems. There's different reasons why we have inequality, but again, it's not talked about enough as an endogenous result of having that lack of reinvestment and skills, et cetera. And when you have value extracted out, inequality is also one of the outcomes, because value that's created is not then shared, right? If it's just used to, say, boost capital markets. But it's also, of course, due to other things, including reduced negotiating power by weak trade unions and so on. But this is obviously a huge problem, and people like Piketty have and Zuckman and others have increased our ability to analyze it with great data. But again, relating in changes in inequality also to some of the issues that I'll be talking about not just value extraction, but also lame government policy that isn't structured properly, with huge government handouts, not being conditional on making sure that companies are investing in better working conditions and also sharing the wealth that they're creating. So I'll come back to that later. Again, this is just my quick scenario of why things suck and why we actually need to talk about directionality. Fourth, huge problem, the climate one. I don't have to say more about this. We all know it's a huge issue. We're not moving quick enough. The IPCC gave us a terrible report card, said we had 10 years left, and we're still not meeting the targets that we should be year by year to 2030. And also, it's not just that we don't have enough investment in green and renewable energy, but lots of sectors aren't transforming their production lines quick enough. So it's obviously about, a green transition across the entire economy, not just about renewable energy. And lastly, the state's problem. This is something I've written about a lot. And in fact, I'm going to start with this one in terms of what we then need to do about this all. So what is the state's problem? It's that it's been kind of structured in such a way that we think we actually need policy just to fix problems after they arrive. In economics, we try to sound fancy when we say fixing market failures. And it's not that these market failures don't exist. It's simply that if we actually want to have a structural shift, a transformation in our economy, it's going to be actually quite hard to just patch our way, bandage our way, fix our way, fill the gap our way to a better economy. So, we actually need a different way of thinking about the state. Otherwise, the problem is really that it's always too little, too late. By definition, though, because it's actually been asked to wait for a failure to arise, or to preempt it at least, but not to really reimagine what are we even trying to build. So what I want to do in the 17 minutes I've left is to just give you a snapshot of some ideas that I've been working on most recently on some practical solutions, or not solutions, but ideas, and how to help governments and policymakers at all sorts of different levels, city, regional, state, and international, think about these issues. I will quickly go over, for those who don't know, some of my work on the entrepreneurial state and why a lot of this has to kind of begin with rethinking the role of the state. I'll talk a bit about my more recent book around value and why it's not enough just to talk about better policy, but we need to underpin it by a different approach about value. Value is collectively created by different types of organizations, and so they have to also be reinvesting in their own organizational competence, something the state also doesn't do. But it's not only wrong not to do that if underlying all that is a value theory that doesn't even understand state structures as value creating. That's obviously part of the problem. And again, more recently on kind of implementing this concept of a purpose-driven approach around a tool that I call missions. So quickly, the state, the entrepreneurial state. What I argued in my book is that, stupid assumptions get stupid answers. So this idea that the state is simply there to fix, to at best facilitate, to enable, to level the playing field, this weird word that we've all sort of accepted, as opposed to tilting the playing field towards big, bold directions, has absolutely been part of the problem. This cartoon image of the dynamic, creative business sector is actually embedded within microeconomic theory. There's no actual, state that is creating value within the production function. It at best, again, fixes problems or redistributes that value. And, this is fed to us all the time. I'm not going to, the Economist talks about it. State, of course, is important. We're not the Tea Party, but really just stick to the basics, infrastructure, skills, education, then please get the hell out of the way. Right? So that's fed to us. If you don't know about this by The Economist, it's in the editorial almost every week, even though in the inside of The Economist are fascinating things happening around the world, the editorial line doesn't seem to change. And, the first thing is, had that been true, if the state really was there just to fix markets, we wouldn't have any of the big general purpose technologies of the ones I listed up here. And for sure, we wouldn't be able to get a green transition. We need to learn what actually got us things like the IT revolution, thinking forwards, but also actually make it even more difficult, because the big social problems that I began with are even harder, say, than getting to the moon. These are deep societal wicked problems, but still, we need to begin with what we know happened in the past. And market failure policies did not get us all these big technological revolutions. What we actually also required was a much more dynamic, entrepreneurial, strategic, decentralized network of state institutions. Different people have written about this, including, I recommend you read Fred Bloch's work, as well as my work, of course, but Fred Bloch also wrote a great book with Matthew Keller called The State of Innovation. So what I did in the entrepreneurial state was also look at all these different organizations that have been absolutely fundamental to getting us big, radical changes, and say, why don't we talk about that? The internet, GPS, touchscreen, Siri, it wasn't only publicly funded. That itself is a big surprise to many, but it was through public organizations. And what do we know about the organizational culture, literally the HR culture, the need to welcome risk-taking, et cetera? This has actually become more fashionable to talk about it, but it's it's still not like a dummy variable in our regressions. If you have public investment, was it kind of mission oriented and strategic or not, or was it just kind of handing out money randomly to SMEs and to other organizations? So this is something I've talked about quite a bit in my work, and through that kind of got more and more interested in this notion of missions as helping to understand how markets are actually created and not just fixed. And so if you look at NASA, ARPA-E, the NIH, different development banks, they actually all have missions to transform their landscapes, to actually change what's around them, not just to fix the existing kind of status quo gaps in the system. I organized a big conference back in 2013 about this, and I remember the head of ARPA-E, Cheryl Martin, one of the first heads of ARPA-E, she said that they could only be successful if they explicitly actually welcomed risk-taking. And she said they actually measured their success by how much risk they were willing to take and how much economy-wide success they had. So those issues around what does it mean to be a DARPA-type institution, an ARPA-type institution in terms of risk-taking, but also sharing the rewards that come from that risk-taking, that doesn't happen unless you kind of begin with this fundamental rethink of what do we even mean by the state in the economy beyond just fixing markets. And the reason I set up the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, where some of you I know who are listening study with us, is that I believe that actually it's not just about better policy. We need actually new minds, as Che Guevara used to say. And so we've set up a whole master's in public administration for global bureaucrats. We're trying to rewrite the curriculum, change the language, the theory, the narrative, but also the practice. We kind of begin by saying we need literally a new vocabulary in the same way that I think lots of things need to change by talking about them differently, not fixing, but co-creating, not de-risking, welcoming, and so on. So I do think this is critical, this critical mind change and new framing of actively co-creating and co-shaping and not fixing. And it also has to be underpinned, and this is a second point, by also rethinking economic value and asking, well, where does value actually come from? Because it's hard, again, to get the state to actually act in a more strategic way if the underlying principle is that it's just there, again, distributing the existing value that's created in the business community. And I do think that the stories we tell about value and wealth creation are actually really important. And coming back to the point about Piketty and those who've helped us really think about inequality, if you look at the data, how it's changed, and you look at particular decades, what I've been fascinated by is particular decades where inequality was rising fastest, how it was also accompanied by particular narratives and stories about who the wealth creators are, right? So at the end of the 1970s, it was actually, and this is something also that Lozanic talks about quite a bit, it was the National Venture Capital Association that actually lobbied really hard to get capital gains tax to fall by almost 50% in just 4 years. But similarly, if you look at what the pharmaceutical industry has done around tax, it's was accompanied by we are the wealth creators, reduce our tax, and both capital gains and different types of tax incentives. And of course, corporate taxation itself has, doesn't just rise or fall. It needs to be lobbied to change. And we need to unpick those very stories that are told about that. I don't have much time to go through the next slide, so I'll just say them quickly. What I do in the book is I go through this kind of massive change that's occurred in how we think about economic value. And that, students of economics nowadays aren't even taught the history of value. It's just kind of called Econ 101, and one value theory is presented. But really the big change is that it went from being seen as objectively kind of created, and the lens on value creation was in fact on production, and also that the debate was about what is value, where is it located, how is it distributed, how is it circulated, and that itself then created also a theory of price. Whereas today we have the opposite. We have a theory of price that creates a theory of value, and the value theory we have is actually based on subjective, not objective considerations. So in the book, I look at, both the physiocrats and how they set up this wonderful tableau économique where they placed value as being housed in the farming community, looked then at how it was just redistributed throughout the system. And we're really worried about when there was too much value being extracted out by the sterile class, the merchants and the landlords, at what that would actually do to the reproduction of the system itself, hence the word sterility. But similarly, the classical Smith, Ricardo, and Marx, they also look very much at production. And instead of, emphasizing farm labor, they looked at industrial labor. But if you read Smith, for example, he also was really concerned with this problem of value extraction. In fact, the free market, the notion of the free market in Smith was not free from the state, but free from value extraction, free from rent seeking. And he really looked at all the different things that would have to happen to limit that. But the pin factory example that's up here on the slide, that was because he was very concerned with the division of labor. He believed that investment in new organizations of production, and later David Ricardo and Karl Marx focused more on mechanization, but that it was actually the division of labor and improvements to production that increased productivity, growth, and then aggregate that up to the wealth of nations. And you know, his fear of value being extracted out made him actually think that rent itself was theft, rent was robbery. And what's quite interesting, though, moving on, does it move? There we go. You know, this emphasis in the classicals to objective conditions of production, to the relationship between production and income mediated through power issues, who owns the means of production, wages being linked also to those power issues, not choices between leisure versus work, and this focus on reproduction and the problems around rent seeking kind of all then disappeared with neoclassical economics. And the reverse causation happened, as I mentioned. Instead of having a big debate of what is value, how is it circulated, the causation went from what is a theory of exchange, and that became a theory of value. Value is revealed through the price system itself. And by subjective, I mean it's all based on individual decision making, right? You have companies maximizing their individual profits, consumers maximizing their individual utility, workers maximizing their individual decisions of leisure versus work, and you aggregate it up to supply and demand, and you get these prices which then are deemed to reveal value. So this is what I argue needs to be completely unpicked, at least to have, you know, a big debate about value. It absolutely does matter. It determines how we understand who gets what and why. So inequality, it determines what's counted. You know, we only include in GDP things that have prices without actually asking, is it creating or not value? How we govern organizations, again, the concept of shareholder value, how we price things. So, you know, value-based pricing of pharmaceuticals, again, something that I've written quite a bit. You can also read some of our recent work on value-based pricing on the IAPP website, and how that itself is nested within an approach to value. How we think of governing digital platforms is also related to it, and the role of the state. I don't have time to look at all those bullet points. I'll just, again, given the theme of my talk, focus on the role of the state. You know, again, coming back to this notion that the state is there just to fix markets that I began with, also is deeply a problem in terms of its ability to, again, co-create value if we don't even understand its role in the value production itself. But you really do, again, see this in GDP, where a lot of things the state does, which might be freely available, think of public education, public health, we only include the costs of those things, right? So hence the emphasis on spending, state spending, the need to actually think about investing towards actually achieving these directional shifts. It's not only a change of vocabulary, but we actually need new accounting mechanisms. And different people have talked about why it's important to look at how do we actually value, say, healthcare systems and public health, especially during a pandemic. But also the training that actually then filters down from the market failure theory, which has been fed through new public management and public choice theory, doesn't actually train, civil servants to think of themselves as actively value creating. If anything, it's about be careful, you might get corrupted and captured along the way. So really just fix your little problem and then let kind of business do the rest. And also this idea that you need to make government efficient with efficiency metrics that are actually being fed through from the private sector completely strips the kind of big discussion of, the state actually being there to be, again, transformational for creating public goods and to, actually focus also on a lot of the spillovers that might happen along the way, as opposed to just very narrow cost benefit and net present value calculations. So lastly, in my last 5 minutes, I wanted to, and I'm kind of building here the point of why this, these points about directionality that I began with require a new understanding of the entrepreneurial state, rethinking our underlying assumptions about value, but also this notion of purpose that I mentioned in the beginning, which absolutely needs to come into our ways of thinking, not just about corporate governance, but also public-private relations. And so what I've been doing in recent years is talking to governments about lots of these issues and the entrepreneurial state and some of these ideas around value. But the way to kind of frame it has been, hey, think about one of the most ambitious things we've done as humanity, the hardest things, getting to the moon and back again 50 years ago. That didn't happen from market fixing. That didn't happen from maximizing shareholder value. There was lots of companies, by the way, big companies, big corporates, profit maximizing corporates that helped us get there. But they were much, very much directed in some ways by, the notion of what we were trying to achieve. So General Electric, Honeywell, Motorola, these were all companies that invested and innovated and worked closely with NASA to get to the moon. There was lots of different sectors. It wasn't just aeronautics. It was also nutrition, materials, electronics. The whole software industry actually came out as a spillover from that. So, coming back to this notion of the state needing to be more proactive, strategic, big thinking, around big goals, but also the private sector needing to rethink its purpose and not just focus on quarterly returns, but still making a profit. It's quite useful to see what it took to get there. And so I wrote a report for the European Commission, which now we're actually working with many countries around the world, this report here that you see there, saying, look, let's just take as an example innovation policy. What would it look like if the innovation budget of the Commission had a chunk of it, which wasn't just blabbing on about challenges, but made them serious as getting to the moon and back again. And the idea is that you begin with the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. So these are the challenges, the big challenges we have. You turn them into concrete missions, carbon neutral cities, plastic free ocean, or at a city level, zero knife crime, and think of all the different sectors that would need to be involved in that. And in fact, transform industrial strategy to be less about a list of sectors that the state gives out money to through grants, loans, or whatever, but actually different sectors that work together, directed, not in a micromanaged way, but still directed in a tilting the playing field kind of way towards these big goals. And then this is the key point, redesigning instruments like procurement, grants, and loans to really galvanize and catalyze that bottom-up experimentation on how you get there. So whether you think of the Clean Oceans SDG, the climate change one, turning them into really concrete goals here, like the plastic-free ocean, carbon-neutral cities, all those different sectors that are needed, and that bottom-up experimentation to get there, that's more or less kind of the thinking. And I have other slides, which I'm sure will be sent to you later, maybe if they're shared, but I just wanted to move on to say, this isn't just about better policy. We actually need different institutions. So any public instrument or public organization, this is the case of a public bank, but an instrument would be, say, procurement, can be redesigned to really be more mission-oriented. So this was some work we did with the Scottish government, setting up a completely new public bank. They didn't have one, but also to make sure it wasn't there just to hand out money to whichever sector or firm shouted loudest, but actually made it a kind of purpose-driven, mission-oriented bank. And this means also creating conditions attached, like the KfW, the German bank did recently. When it lent money to the steel sector, it was conditional on steel actually reducing its material content. That happened not because they went to Davos and talked about it. Sorry, I keep bashing Davos. But anyway, but because they had to in order to access the loan. And lastly, because I've just been told I have 1 minute left, one of the big things I think around this is if you are going to have a risk-taking, active, entrepreneurial, mission-oriented, value-creating state, obviously this means, you will be taking risks. So how do we also use this as an opportunity to not just share risks, but also share rewards? Again, I've been writing about this for quite some time. Happy to send you some references around this. But, whether it's about retaining a golden share of the intellectual property rights, conditions on reinvesting profits instead of extracting them out through share buybacks, conditions around equity stakes. I've often used the example of Tesla as a crazy investment that the US made without taking any equity, and they ended up giving the same amount to Solyndra, which they had to bail out. So that portfolio approach to their risk-taking, that's all kind of interesting and is especially important now with COVID, where there's lots of public-private collaborations around the vaccine or therapies, but we need to embed within how we produce the vaccine to actually really foster that public in common good. So the World Health Organization, who we're working with closely, has been talking about fostering collective intelligence through a patent pool, but also there's different conditionalities. This is my last slide. Around the kind of, again, bailouts that particular sectors are getting. So Macron was quite bold, saying that, the government wasn't there just to save industry, but to help transform it. So they put strong conditions attached to the bailouts of both Renault and Air France, whereas in the UK, we just gave 600 million to EasyJet and let them run with it. So I think this kind of moment of crisis where lots of money is going into the system is interesting, again, to experiment and be creative with these kinds of conditionalities in terms of really building back better. And to do that, we have to be thinking about public value, public purpose, missions, both in terms of the theory and the practice. And so apologies, I'm 1 minute over, but happy to take questions.
Thank you, Mariana. Very good. I really appreciate your thoughts on the importance of industrial strategy for the recovering from the pandemic and how mission-oriented policy could be a way for this purpose. I'm excited to see how young scholars dive into this topic in future. And now we have a few questions from the audience. Just a quick reminder to everyone, the submitted questions are not to be answered directly, but reflected upon regarding their relevance for future research projects. So let's see the question 1. What kind of welfare state do you need for the post-pandemic world?
So, what's interesting is changing how we think about the welfare state. So we often think about welfare on one side and innovation on another. And I've been arguing recently that we need to go from the welfare state to the innovation state, where the way that we actually do investment in innovation embeds within it inclusive growth. So that was part of the sharing the risks and rewards. It's not just about, throwing in a lot of money and then hoping for the best and then requiring the welfare state to pick up the pieces. What the welfare state should be doing is not just always, being so taken up by redistributional issues because we get the pre-distribution wrong, but really thinking extremely boldly about public services, the best designed public healthcare system, the best designed public education system, a well-designed pension system, let me turn off my phone. A well-designed, it is off, how strange. Public education, public transport, public health, and then letting, making sure that the contracts, that kind of social compact that we do from the beginning is done rightly, so we actually get the right distribution of income and don't have to just pick up the pieces afterwards with taxation. We need progressive taxation, but if you look at, for example, Gabriel Palma's work, he's shown how in many countries, even those with generous welfare states, so much of what the state is being focused on is precisely those kind of redistributional areas because we get it all wrong ex ante. And I think this is where the opportunity is to bring pre-distribution kind of notions to the table. And I think there's a huge area of research there. What does it mean to get the kind of public, private, third sector, citizen kind of compact right in the first place that actually produces inclusive growth? And so the welfare state should be applying, the best that we have in 21st century technology, but also thinking to design public services and public goods in a really innovative, creative way. And shouldn't always be kind of, again, too little, too late, picking up the pieces when we get that wrong. And there's no better place to look at this than the US healthcare system.
Thank you. So now let's see the question 2. How we convert current leaders to your vision that is for them new and revolutionary?
I mean, to be honest, I've been quite, pleasantly surprised since I first wrote The Entrepreneurial State. I wrote it first as a pamphlet in 2011. I wrote it quickly and I just wanted to get it out there. So I partnered with the think tank to send out, thousands of copies to all the politicians. Later, I wrote it properly as a book with extra chapters around green, around the iPhone. But already in 2011, this idea of the entrepreneurial state got really picked up. There was lots of articles about it. And so it's not about converting thinking to it. I almost feel like a lot of people were converted quite quickly. There was a thirst for this new notion. I think what really we need to be asking is, what does it mean to then embed the thinking, not just in great speeches or statements, but in the everyday, how we do government. Again, procurement. Procurement budgets are huge in most governments, even in developing countries. And if this thinking about the state as driving, transformational change and goal-oriented isn't nested within how we do procurement, that's a huge loss of an opportunity. Similarly with grants and loans. So I think we need to just start getting our hands dirty also as an academic community and stop just lecturing about, oh, austerity sucks, invest. Well, how? How? What is our concrete proposal if you set up a public bank to make sure that it doesn't become a disastrous public bank? There's many disastrous public banks that literally just save the day to pretty crappy companies that maybe should go under. What does it mean to be a mission-oriented public bank? What does it mean to bring public value considerations and purpose to the center of how a public organization understands its own remit? We're doing work with the BBC, for example, as an organization, not the news channels, the BBC as a public organization around its own understanding of public value, how they've used it, how to measure it. We're working with finance ministries and how they evaluate, public investments and public value creation. And we need to get our hands dirty with that, because if we don't do that, all these great ideas that we have, the anti-austerity kind of pitches don't go anywhere because we haven't created kind of a much more granular understanding of how to do this differently. And also we haven't linked it to an alternative theory of what the state is for around shaping and creating. But the thirst is out there. So that's my quick answer, that a lot of politicians are interested, but there's not enough of us also in the academic community really guiding them and helping, as well as learning. It's not just about, talking to them, telling them what to do, but learning what actually happens on the ground, what works, what doesn't. We have to be humble, and academics aren't always humble enough.
Thank you, Mariana. We don't have time for other questions, but before we close this part of session, would you like to suggest a new question, any topic that was not addressed in the questions?
Yeah, I actually sent over some questions to you all. And I'll add one on top of the one I sent. I do think this concept of public value is really important. So what is public value? I think that itself is an interesting question. It's at the center of the work we're doing in the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. But one of the other questions I sent over was, how do we actually explicitly steer economies away from value extraction towards value creation? And how do we do that in such a way that also along the way changes how we think about value, but also that brings this pre-distribution agenda to the fore, right? So kind of getting the conditions right ex ante instead of picking up the mess ex post.
Okay, thank you. So thank you very much for your participation. Your contributions are very valuable for our future projects. And with that, the first part of the session is a wrap, but the second part is about to begin. But first, back to the studio.
Welcome back to the Lighthouse. Wow, what a session. Mariana, thank you so much for your input. If you've been following the questions graph, it's been exploding with questions that we're now going to get into. Mariana's points are extremely valuable to us, as Fernanda has said. Thanks once again. Now, let's head over into the questions graph, back into the constellation to look at all the questions that have been contributed back to the studio, back to the constellation.
Yes, I should wait for this to, okay, yeah, here we go. Hi everyone, glad to see you all back in the constellation. What an amazing talk, right? We have had a pretty significant participation, and we have had a lot of questions as well. So I guess many of you have already done this, but if you haven't, what we are going to do now is basically we are going to look at the most liked questions that have been posed, and we are going to discuss them and try to rephrase them to reach better, more precise, more pertinent formulations for them in order to see whether we can make these questions the favorite questions for all the participants in the plenary. This is our goal. And so for the next several minutes, we are going to go through a few of these questions. As you can see in the constellation, on the right, you have the option to suggest a rephrasing for a question. First, I'm going to read to you the 4 questions that we are going to discuss, and then we are going to go one by one. And if you wish to speak, if you want to comment or suggest how we should approach these questions, you can do that. You can raise your hand here and we will unmute you. So the first question we are going to look at is the question that Professor Mazzucato has commented first on, which is, what kind of welfare state do we need for the post-pandemic world? Afterwards, we are going to turn to the question that has in the meantime has arisen among the questions, having 18 likes, which is, what capacity do developing countries have for implementing industrial and innovation policies? Then we are going to turn to another question that we have heard Professor Mazzucato speak about. How can we convert current leaders to your vision that is for them new and revolutionary? And we have heard some of her own suggestions how we should rephrase this. And finally, if we get the chance, we are going to think for a moment about the question, do you have any advice for current government employees in steering federal government toward public good? So we start with the first one, and we can already see, I hope you all see it, several additional phrasings. The question is, what kind of welfare state do we need for the post-pandemic world? And now, if we have someone who wants to say something, this would be the time. The additional rephrasings that we have for the moment are, what innovative ways can states employ to include corporate and communities to build the economies post-pandemic? Then we have another one, what innovative ways can states employ to, okay, this one is the same, so we are going to delete it because it is repeated. Then we have another one, what is the future of the welfare state in the 21st century? And finally, how can the welfare state provide public goods and services in new and creative ways? I think that one of the things that Professor Mazzucato mentioned is the concept of welfare state itself, whether we want to stick to it in the manner that it is traditionally used, or maybe we want to change that. In any case, we are going to stop here and try to think about this. We are not going to go for any further questions. We are just going to try to rephrase this. And if you think that one of the other formulations is better than this original one, then you can show that to your likes. We see that what is the future of welfare state in the 21st century is receiving a lot of likes. We'll take another 2 minutes for this question.
Is there a link to the questions? I don't see them. I just see the screen. I think as I was on the other Zoom.
Right.
When you shared it. Can you share it again?
Yes. Rebecca, can you do that?
You guys are too technological. Whatever happened to speaking?
This is a big
millennials.
electronic construction that we have here. Okay, we have a comment by Anisha. You should have, Mariana, you should have the link now in the chat. Anisha.
Okay.
Let me try to, okay, here is Anisha.
Hey, hello. Thank you so much, Mariana, for the wonderful presentation. And I think this question about the welfare state is picking up steam here. And I think the rephrasing also. I see that there's a common thread between all the three rephrasing, that the welfare state as such is going to change. We're going to have some change to how we define the welfare state. So even when the phrasing talks about what is the future of welfare state in the 21st century, what essentially the person who has mentioned this comment is moving towards is, will the old welfare state continue to exist, or we're going to move towards something which is more innovative? So we would like to, like start the conversation. What kind of innovative steps can the welfare state take? Like what kind of changes can you observe would be the next debate that would happen once we have questioned the entire fundamental basis of what a welfare state does. So clearly what you mentioned is it's not market failure. You don't come towards the end to pick up the pieces, but rather you direct the economy, you direct the resources towards bigger goals, whether it is sustainability, whether it's more employment, whether it's more productivity, and not come at the last moment to sort of like correct the market failures, but rather from the very beginning, you move towards something which is bigger. So we should actually open up the conversation and invite other people to also say and talk about how do you rephrase, like what are the more or different kind of innovative views on the welfare state for this century.
Thanks, Anisha. That's great. Yeah, so if anyone has anything to add, maybe on how we could reformulate, that would be great.
And also, I'm sorry to jump in, but also, Mariana, you are more than welcome to suggest new phrasings. You can just bring them to our attention and we can type them in the platform, or if you want to give comments on what Anisha said, just feel free to jump in.
I mean, I unfortunately have to go also because I'm actually, the reason I have to go is with Tedros, the head of WHO. We're thinking about this and we have a conversation in 10 minutes about that, which is, we have global health systems on their knees. What does it mean actually in a very concrete way to, instead of thinking about health systems here, and that's kind of the welfare state discussion, and health innovation there, right? These are usually two totally different worlds, to bring them together. So how we do health innovation driven by the public interest and the common good would already start structuring, again, public, private, third sector interactions in such a way that create the kind of systems we need, as opposed to screwing everything up so then the welfare state has to come in later and pick up the pieces. But I just think there's different levels of analysis. One is the state, and then you guys have just brought it to something more specific, which is the welfare state, right? Because when I talked about the state, it was also about state financing of, infrastructure, of technology, about thinking about carbon neutral cities, governing AI. And I think that's what we need to rethink, because a lot of what we mean by the welfare state has been problematic because it's been confined to a very narrow area, precisely because we've confined the state to a narrow area. So in rethinking the welfare state, what we're actually doing is rethinking the state itself. And so if you did actually have a much more ambitious state, which was held accountable, by the way, by notions of public value, again, a concept that we're working on a lot in the Institute. I welcome any of you to get in touch if you're interested in this. I saw someone asked in the chat, Hector, if we're working in IPP on the welfare state. Yes, through Hillary Cottom's work. Her book called Radical Help is really interesting on the design question. How do we design our services better? But what I'm trying to provoke you all to think about is, before we even design the exact services in a better way, you need to start off by thinking, how have we assumed that the state's role in the economy is limited? And within that, how have we then put it in a corner to, to structure, say, social services in a particular way, as opposed to innovating and investing in such a way that actually creates value in a different way, which would then create a different type of service also that's needed. So I think I've already talked enough before in the lecture, so I'll shut up. But I think that's where the challenge is, which is to disrupt this narrow definition of the welfare state and to bring the innovation state within that, and these notions of the common good and public interest to supersede this limited notion of public goods, which are really just failures of where the private sector doesn't invest enough.
Thanks.
Thank you.
That was great. Yeah.
And also
What
maybe
does
we
Rebecca say
can.
about my glasses? Someone says I have rock and roll glasses.
I like your glasses very much, and I like even more your answer, because it leads us to broaden up a little bit the discussion. And since the idea of the 100 most pertinent questions is actually to build questions that then can steer our research in the future, thinking not only or directly about the welfare state, but try to broaden up a little bit the discussion and try to think of the state, the concept of the state, the meaning of the state, and already within the economy and not as an external participant that intervenes in the economy. I think that's key. Maybe it's because I'm the outgoing coordinator of the States and Markets Working Group, but I think it should be of utmost importance for all of us. So I invite you, I don't know if you agree, Sasha, I invite you all to think of alternative phrasings that take this point into consideration. We are not only trying to rebuild the welfare state or think about how it should be like, but actually we are trying to think about the state and how it should be rebuilt to create a better future for all. And again, thank you very much, Mariana. I think it's already your time for the next meeting. I don't want to keep you here any longer. It's been great to have you here.
So we now...
Great, well, thank you so much. I was just putting another link, or maybe I'm out of, there we go. I'd be happy to, again, engage with you guys some other time on this. And please do check out our webpage of the Institute. We have different events. Would love to bring you in. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, Mariana.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Bye.
And with that, we now turn to the second question we are going to try to rephrase. So as for this question, we are now kind of split between the original formulation and the formulation that refers to the 21st century. You can still change your likes, you can still add rephrasings for this question. But we are going to now move our discussion, as we are running out of time, very quickly to the question about developing countries. So the current formulation that has already 20 likes is: what capacity do developing countries have for implementing industrial and innovation policies? So this is, I guess, something that we haven't discussed that much directly during the talk, but is obviously very relevant for the topic. Hector, did you want to say something on this?
Yes. Hi, everybody.
Please,
I'm sorry, but it was about the first question, because actually I suggest that question, and I think just briefly, I think the idea to think the welfare state in the 21st century is the key question, because I think we need to keep thinking in a normative way what we want about the state and welfare in specific. So I think it would be great to combine, because I was thinking in post-pandemic world, because we're in the middle of the crisis, but I think a right angle will be thinking in the century, in the 21st century. I think that fit better with the overall problems that we are discussing in the plenary. So I think I will really endorse that change. So what kind of welfare state we need for the 21st century will be probably a best way to ask the question.
Thank you, Hector. I think we had another hand risen, but I don't see it right now. Could you, who was that? If you want to speak, you can do that now. We still have only one phrasing for...
I don't see any raised hand. So
yeah,
if
there
someone was raising the hand before, maybe that person is not doing it anymore. Maybe she can help us and raise the hand again.
Yeah.
If not, we can keep on rethinking about the questions. Maybe think if we maybe think also a little bit about what Mariana was suggesting, I totally agree with the importance of trying to rework on the concept of the welfare state and what type of welfare state we need for the 21st century. But also, can we think of the welfare state without thinking at the same time of other angles, as Mariana was saying, of the role of the state in terms of finance, infrastructure, technological innovation, and so on. So I'm just wondering whether we should expand this question a bit more and maybe include how to rebuild or rethink the role of the state concerning, and then add a couple of things concerning the welfare state, concerning its role in financing missions or key missions for the economy, and so on and so forth.
Anisha, did you want to say something? I still see your hand risen. Maybe if you want to speak. I don't know if it's just a glitch in the system.
I'm so sorry. No, it's the glitch. I haven't raised my hand yet.
Do this then. Okay. Seems we have. Oh, okay. Now we have another. Phrasing here. How can entrepreneurial states create value in the global economy without resorting to zero-sum game adopted by neo-mercantilist states in the past? This is another formulation, quite precise one. So if you think that one is better than the original one, please hit the like for that one, and we can see which one gathers more. But while you're doing that, we're going to move to the third question, since we do have only another 5 minutes left for doing this. And that is a question that we have heard being discussed, which is, how can we convert current leaders to your vision that is for them new and revolutionary? This has 12 likes, but we already have several different, or we have one different formulation. It probably because of the glitches we have 3 or 4 times submitted the same additional formulation, which is, how can we influence the current nation's leaders to adopt a revolutionary vision like innovation and entrepreneurial state? This would be a different way to frame this question. If you have another one, this would be the time.
I was just wondering, while people think about rephrasing, if we should just take for granted current leaders. And I think about the example of Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez in the US. I don't know if you're familiarized with her story, but she was not engaged in politics. And she decided to engage because, as most of us, I guess, she was acknowledging that many things were going wrong, and she didn't want to wait until some politician made things right. Because these people, most of them, I'm pretty sure they heard about Mariana Mazzucato and her ideas, as well as many other ideas. So probably it is that they are actually being influenced by other streams of thought, by other perspectives. They are defending other interests. And so I'm wondering if the right question to be asked is how to make them realize of something, because we're already assuming they don't know all this. And we also assume that if they knew, they would do things differently. So I would rather ask, how can we as economists be more engaged in political discussions, and how can we build better tools to provide answers and easy ways of understanding economics, not so much to politicians, but to people in general, so that they realize when they listen to someone that presents fresh, new ideas that are compelling, they are more open to those ideas. But it's complicated. This is a complicated question to rephrase, I know, because it's already focused on a certain angle. So I don't know a precise rephrasing, but I just wanted to bring this up to all of you.
Thanks, Cecilia. yeah, so in any case, we have some likes for the other formulation, but we seem to be still somewhere, still mostly converging on the original one. And maybe now we can introduce the final question that we could discuss here, which is how can we advance a transformative change in development using innovation? I guess this is another question that deals with development, which is an important aspect, and I guess specifically for developing countries, it makes a huge difference and maybe differentiates the states and their capacity to use innovation in this manner. Luigi, would you want to say something? If so,
actually, my comment was.
Yeah, it's a bit glitchy. We don't hear you that well.
Yeah, actually, my comment was on the previous question, not on.
That's all good. That's also good. Please. Go
okay.
Ahead.
Following up on what Cecilia was saying, I was feeling like her development on the question itself was begging an even broader question of the political interface. Like she was talking about how economists and, well, I guess experts can interface with the political environment. But then this begs the question of, is the political interface needing a huge renewal so that economists or civil society, I guess, or other experts can better interface with, and hence enabling the possibility of influencing current leaders. I know Mariana Mazzucato is interfacing a lot. She also has built up this possibility of interfacing, but is it the best way, I guess? I guess it really just, Cecilia's development begged this development.
Thanks, Luigi. Now, I guess since the time is running short, we are going to turn to the final stage of our work on these questions. You will now see the possibility to make one of these questions or multiple a favorite. This is represented by the star on the left. You can do that for the formulation of the question that has received most of likes. So you can choose any of these questions and make it your favorite. If you do that, you have 10 times to use this choice during the plenary. This question will receive a boost towards becoming one of the 100 questions that are selected by us as the top 100 questions of the YSI. We have to finish very quickly, so you can select your favorites. You can continue doing that also after this. And with this, I'm going to close this session. I'm going to thank you all for being with us, and we're going to hand it back to studio.
Hi, thank you, Sasha. Not really in the studio. I'm up here in the galaxy looking at the entire questions graph. And this is just to show you. Now I think I'm in the way, but if you look over here, yeah, a second ago you could see it. Can you go back to that screen you were on first? Here you can see all these questions that we just discussed in the innovation constellation. And you can see the blue ones are the one that was submitted by Mariana, and you can see all the questions that were now created. And then you have to remember that even though the session is over, so the questions have now been uploaded, this is the time for you to go and pick the 10 favorite questions. Those questions will be added to your YSI profile, and then will be part of deciding over the course of the entire plenary which questions will be part of the 100 questions. Those are the ones that are connected with lines and are in the constellations. Now you can show the other picture. Yeah, and here you can see the most recent questions in the innovation constellation. This is the first time of 2 today that we're going to be in the innovation constellation. After we hear Julie Nelson in 15 minutes, then later on we will come back to the innovation constellation tonight with, depending on where in the world you are, but later on today, with Bill Lasonic. Okay, this was an amazing session. Thank you to everyone who took part, especially to Mariana Mazzucato, and see you in 15 minutes for Julie Nelson. Thank you.